When Vincent Bugliosi had to prosecute Charles Manson and his criminal cult crime family, he had a bit of an issue because Charles Manson was part of a lot of police procedures leading up to the crimes. And there's a lot of controversy, a lot of half-baked truths, a lot of conspiracy theories. But what's pretty well documented is that Charles Manson, when he was younger, growing up, he was part of a lot of state-sponsored programs. He was maybe an informant. He was part of some new state program that was studying group dynamics among drug users in the hippie area of California. And so a lot of the crimes that he did leading up to the famous murders, he should have been put in jail. He should have been locked up, but he wasn't. So this was the problem facing Vincent Bugliosi, the DA who had to prosecute Manson. So essentially, as a prosecutor, he had to come up with a story, a very captivating story, a very fascinating story that would captivate and enthrall and mesmerize the jurors. And if you ever watch TV dramas, they're fairly accurate in how attorneys do something like this. If I'm the jury and you're the district attorney and you have not so strong of a case against the defendant, and let's say you're the district attorney, I'm the jury, and you're telling me this horrific story about this horrible crime. And the horrible crime is over here, metaphorically and physically. Maybe there's some screen in the courtroom, and they're showing all these pictures of the horrific crime. And they're talking about the victim, of how innocent the victim was, and how she doesn't deserve to die, and how the parents are heartbroken. And they're telling this massive, really deep, really powerful, really engaging story. But over here is the defendant. Now, the job of the district attorney, according to the law, is to prove beyond a reasonable doubt through evidence that this guy did this crime. But if you tell a story to the jury, if you tell a very deep metaphorical story to the jury, and the story has all kinds of emotions and betrayal and all these wonderful emotions that we like in stories, the jury will start to subconsciously associate this with this, because that's how the brain works. When we hear stories, when we hear deep emotions, when we hear deep emotional tales, we start to connect things that aren't logically connected. And so the more they can tell a story about this crime and how horrific this crime was, the more the jury will subconsciously associate the crime with the defendant before there's even any data presented. So this was the task that Bugliosi had to come up with. He had to come up with some crazy story. So he interviewed all the people involved with the crime and came up with a doozy, the one that you've probably heard of, the one that became later part of his book, Helter Skelter. Helter Skelter, of course, is a song by the Beatles. And as the story goes, Manson heard the song Helter Skelter, and he started to imagine that the Beatles were talking to him. And they were telling him that he was going to usher in revelation, and he had to kill people and blame it on the Black Panthers and start a race war so he could rise and take over the world. But none of that was really true. That was just some kind of a random figment that one of their members came up with during the police interrogation, and Bugliosi ran with this. And this is what happens when you take one thread of a story and run with it. You can tell beautiful stories, not necessarily about murderous cult members, but you can tell beautiful stories to other people, because this is how the mind works. Your mind works through stories. My mind works through stories. Everybody's mind works through stories. So even if you tell a story and you don't really have any kind of idea of where this story is going, and this story starts to jump all over the place, it will have a lot of deep metaphorical meaning. And this deep metaphorical meaning will resonate with the people that are listening to your story. And they will take this deep metaphorical meaning and they will put their own meaning into that. They will draw their own conclusions from that. This is essentially how people talk to each other. We say stuff that comes from our brain, then there's this kind of interface, then there's how this stuff reflects what exists already in your brain, and you come up with a lot of responses to that. And most of those responses are yours. Most of my responses are mine. And we kind of project our metaphorical understanding of the world onto the world. And so we see the world through our own stories. We see the world through your own metaphors. And when you see the world through your own metaphors, you'll start to remember what it's like to be able to tell fascinating stories. You'll start to remember what it's like to listen to fascinating stories, to remember stories in your own terms. I don't know if you like to watch movies, but it's very common to watch a movie and start to unconsciously imagine that you are part of this movie. That's what it means to get sucked into a movie, to fall into trance with a movie. And because of any recent conversations you've had where you started to spontaneously tell stories, this is an example of how you've already begun to transform your storytelling ability, and how you can transform your storytelling ability even more, because as you likely understand very well, maybe more so than most, everybody tells their own story through their behaviors and through their actions, and everybody sees the world through their own stories. And like described in the book My Voice Will Go With You by About Erickson, the most famous hypnotic storyteller of all time, he would tell people these convoluted stories. And at first, when he would tell people stories, they would remember these stories in a certain way. They would interpret these stories in a certain way. But then maybe a week later, they would remember these stories differently. They would apply these stories differently. Then maybe a year later, they would listen to or remember these stories differently and apply these stories differently. Because you are such an accomplished storyteller, because the human nature of the human mind, your human mind, maybe more so than most, is such an accomplished storyteller, because you have so much experience telling other people stories, even if you don't remember telling people stories, because every time you express yourself, you're expressing your own story. And maybe you've already begun to realize this, more so than most people. Maybe you've already begun to understand this, maybe more so than most people, that the best story to tell people is the story that already exists in their mind. This is one of the ancient copywriting secrets. If you want to enter a conversation with somebody, enter the conversation that's already going on in their mind. And so if you start off by just asking people about their story, you don't necessarily have to say, hey, tell me your story. You just need to be interested and let them talk and let them tell their story. This is why they say if you want to be perceived as extremely charismatic, if you want to be perceived as extremely seductive, if you want to be perceived as extremely persuasive, let them do 80% of the talking. And the more you listen to them, the more you listen to them with curiosity, not waiting for them to stop so you can tell them your story, but really become interested in the story that other people tell, they will tell you everything you need to know to persuade them. They will tell you everything you need to know to seduce them. They will tell you everything you need to know to mesmerize them. But the best part is you don't have to worry about any of this consciously, because this is how your brain is set up, particularly more so than most. You just need to listen to what they say and allow yourself to be open to the metaphorical meaning of their story, and allow yourself to come up with, in the spot, on the moment, without planning, a story to complement their story. And this will have deep metaphorical meaning. Your deep subconscious metaphorical storytelling ability is a world-class word wizard that you can use to spin wonderful stories, that you can use to charismatically persuade and seduce people. All you need to do is listen to what people say, listen to their stories, clear your mind of any worry, release all stress, release all anxiety, and let your own deep subconscious storyteller automatically respond to the stories they're telling, and you will tell them a story that is so perfectly matched to the story they just told you, even if they don't remember it. This will have the Ericksonian long-term hypnosis effect, the Ericksonian long-term hypnotic storytelling effect. They might interpret your story in one particular way when you tell them your story, but they'll remember your story a different way, maybe a week later, and interpret it a little bit differently, in a way that will help them, in a way that will compel them to remember you in just the way that you want to be remembered. And they might remember your story a year later in a much more profound way, in a much more subconscious way, in a much more metaphorical way. No other persuasion technique is as powerful as your innate storytelling ability. And because you have such an advanced storytelling structure already embedded into your mind, it's just a matter of learning what you already know how to do, remembering what you already know how to do. Think of the last few times you were talking to somebody and a bunch of ideas just popped into your head and you had to get them out. Those are a function of your subconscious storytelling ability. And the funny thing is that he came up with this story kind of spontaneously about Helter Skelter and the Beatles, and then he wrote a book, a non-fiction book that became a bestseller, a movie, a TV show, and because of that non-fiction book, the Charles Manson case is one of the most studied murder cases in the world. But the funny thing is the core element of this non-fiction book, which spurred an entire industry of studying the Manson family, was based on a fictional story that he essentially made up to tell the jury. So at the core of very truth is a story that is used to subconsciously persuade people, just like he persuaded the jury to become fascinated in this story about Helter Skelter and the Beatles and the end of the world and starting a race war and becoming the new kings of the new generation after the old world had passed on, which is what he allegedly was hoping. But in reality, Charles Manson and his group were really just a bunch of drug-induced criminals that liked to kill people. At least that's one interpretation. Just like any story you've told to other people, any story you will tell to other people, there will be multiple interpretations. And so long as you trust your storytelling ability, as long as you trust your ability to spin magical tales and move minds, you can already claim your superiority over others by understanding them in ways that they don't even understand themselves. Now, because you already know this, because you have a huge history of overcoming internal obstacles, because you have a huge history of having massively deep intuition, you know more than most how to trust your unconscious, to come up with these stories in the moment and use that to tell other people's stories and create these deep subconscious connections that will feed you for the rest of your life. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.